Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for joining us. I can see online that our speakers are also joining us, so many thanks. I'm going to give it another 1 minute and then we'll start off. Okay, I think we're ready to go. So good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome on behalf of the EPC to this hybrid policy dialogue on Turkey's 2023 elections and the implications thereof for migration cooperation with the EU. This event is occurring in the framework of the Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration, or MEDAM. My name is Anastasia Karatzas. I am a junior policy analyst here at the EPC, and I'm very happy to be moderating this event today, which indeed we believe comes at a crucial time, not only for domestic politics within Turkey, but also for the future of cooperation with the EU on migration. Now, having endured periods of relative normalcy, but also periods of tension in previous years, cooperation on migration has indeed come to be defined largely by its transactional nature. This, of course, exemplified by the EU-Türkiye statement of 2016. And as the elections approach, of course, many questions remain about what the future will look like. Now, the elections are indeed set to occur in a time of increasing difficulty in Turkey and for President Erdogan, with questions related to the economy, reconstruction following the earthquake, but of course also foreign policy featuring prominently in the election campaigns. At the same time, anti-refugee and anti-migrant sentiment has been on the increase. And this also leads to concerns for the social cohesion and integration prospects of refugees and migrants in the country, which of course cannot be seen in isolation from the statements that have been made in the lead up to the election from across the political spectrum about stepping up returns and deportations. So against this backdrop, indeed, very important questions emerge about the results of the election and what their implications will be for domestic migration policy, but also, of course, more broadly speaking, for cooperation with the EU on the topic. What might the effects of the changed political climate and the increasing anti-refugee sentiment be for prospects of future cooperation? What should the EU's priorities be? Should they ensure continuity, stability, or should they pursue a shift? And within Turkey, indeed, how can the EU ensure its support for the longer term prospects of refugees and migrants in the country? So with all of these questions in mind, it is indeed really a pleasure to be hosting this event today and to do so in the framework of the MEDAM project, which has placed EU-Türkiye cooperation on migration at the center of its research in previous years. Before we begin with the discussion, I would like to say a quick word on the program and also on our speakers, as well as some housekeeping rules. So to start off, we have a great lineup of speakers with us here today, starting off with Matthias Lücke, who is the MEDAM project head and senior researcher at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Başak Kale online, who is associate professor and chair of European Studies at the Middle East Technical University. Batalla Adam, the Hello Europe Migration Policy Representative at Ashoka and the Secretary General of the EU-Türkiye Forum. Tineke Strik, member of the European Parliament for the Greens Group. And last but certainly not least, Kale Petillo, who is the Program Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Now, a very quick note here that Laura and Başak will be leaving us a few minutes before the end of the event, but that I will make sure to direct any questions you might have for them during the Q&A to them in good time. So a very warm welcome to all of our speakers. Thanks very much for being with us today. We'll be starting off with input statements from each of them for about 6 to 7 minutes. Then we will have a panel discussion among them before moving to a Q&A with all of you here in the audience. For those of you with us here in person, we would be very pleased after the event to have you join us for some light refreshments next door until about 5 p.m. So without further ado, I would like to now hand over to Matthias. Many thanks, Matthias, for joining us, and we're very happy to hear your reflections now for around 6 or 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, and thank you to everybody for joining this meeting. I would like to highlight one basic point that we've made in our previous MEDAM report on EU-Türkiye migration cooperation, and then ask where does that take us in the future. When we think about EU-Türkiye cooperation on migration, it's natural to think of the 2016 statement. And of course, that has been prominent, but there is actually a lot more to it. In fact, since the 2000s, the migration governance in Turkey, the whole system of migration-related policies has been developed in close consultation with the EU and also with considerable EU assistance. This was at that time part of the broader EU accession process. So, for example, the temporary protection regulation in Turkey that applies to Syrian refugees is actually modeled on the temporary protection directive of the EU, which of course the EU never applied to Syrians, but is now applying to Ukrainians. But this is where that policy development is coming from. This means that there is actually a lot of working level contacts between officials in Turkey and in the EU that transcend, that may not be in the public view so much, but that actually are a solid basis for policy dialogue away from the public eye. Quite similarly, the FRIT, the EU facility for refugees in Turkey, isn't just about money flowing towards refugees in Turkey. Quite crucially, the money goes through international organizations and through NGOs. So there is a whole setup, a whole setting of NGOs in Turkey with people thinking about migration issues all the time. And that is part of a lively policy dialogue. And it's probably safe to say that as a result of all this, the public discourse in Turkey about immigrants, specifically Syrian immigrants, has actually shifted quite a bit since people started coming in the early 2010s. Initially, of course, a lot of people in Turkey were thinking of Syrians as temporary guests only. But it has become very clear that people are there to stay, and there has been this growing realization that since people have to stay, will be staying, and will not be able to go back to Syria safely anytime soon. Turkey really needs to think about economic and social integration of refugees. When we wrote our report a year ago, a little more than a year ago, it wasn't quite possible in Turkey to talk about integration as such. There had to be other names like harmonization, but the idea is very clear. This is where the discussion has to be going, and the fact that there is a lot of constructive beginning of that discussion, in our view, could be seen as a result of EU-Türkiye cooperation on migration and migration policy development specifically. So this is one key point that we made about the cooperation. Now, where does that take us going forward? It's like a fast forward, really. I think we all understand, and it's become very, very clear that very few Syrian refugees will voluntarily return to Syria anytime soon. When we were writing the report, there was a relatively recent survey that said that most Syrians in Turkey actually were only willing to go back if they could do safely, which means if there was regime change. Today, we know there is not going to be regime change in Syria anytime soon. This is something that a lot of governments are resigning themselves to. And that means it's really clear that people cannot go back safely. So roughly 4 million refugees will be staying in Turkey for good. So that is a fact, but of course it's also politically divisive. And this is where EU support may potentially come in. As a general rule, we know that when there is sufficient external support, then the presence of refugees does not need to hurt the resident population of a country economically. Of course, hosting refugees is expensive, but this is a financial cost that can be borne by international support. Now, what the EU has done so far in the FRIT is probably a bit more than a drop in an ocean, but it's certainly a long way from the whole cost of hosting refugees in Turkey. We are talking about roughly 1.5 billion euros per year for a number of years. And the commitment has been very strictly limited in time. It was initially for 4 years, then it's being extended by sort of a year and another year. But it's very clear that if we talk seriously about the integration of refugees, this is a process that takes at least 10 years. We know that from people who have arrived in Germany recently. 10 years is a reasonable framework. So we might well think about sufficient support from the EU for Turkey, which would mean a multiple of the money that has been flowing so far, and a commitment to provide that support for as long as it takes to integrate refugees in Turkey. So these could be potentially the elements of a more balanced approach to migration cooperation. Turkey would undertake to promote the economic and social integration of Syrian refugees actively. This is something they've always avoided doing. It would be a big shift still in the discourse in Turkey, while at the same time the EU commits to making this a success and providing substantive support for as long as necessary. And these could be, I wonder, could these be the elements, the core elements of an understanding going forward? Now, of course, then we would need to talk about resettlement. We would need to talk about northern Syria. We need to talk about the readmission of certain irregular immigrants in Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. I guess we will do this in this panel, and I won't speak about it now. But the core elements that I see for a possible renewal of active Turkey EU migration cooperation would be exactly fully sufficient support that actually ensures that the resident population suffers no economic harm, combined with an active approach to integration that has so far been missing, and that would take into account the reality that Syrian refugees are not going anywhere anytime soon from Turkey. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Matthias, for indeed setting the scene for an engaging discussion to come and for raising many relevant elements that are indeed part and parcel of the discussion and future prospects. But of course, given that cooperation with the EU and the future of cooperation is of course inherently linked to the internal dynamics, I'm now very pleased to hand over to Başak. Başak, the floor is yours for about 7 minutes. Please, you should be able to unmute yourself directly. Many thanks.
I did. Thank you. I'll find myself just in case. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to see some familiar faces here as well. So it's quite pleasing to see again, and it's quite, I think, disappointing that we're discussing the same thing over and over again. Yes, migration cooperation, and I would like to give you a little bit more of a domestic outlook of the events. So looking at the things from the EU, it's going to be covered. So I will try to provide you some insights in the recent discussions in Turkey and the current climate, both political climate and I think the social feeling about migration. For those of you who are following the Turkish politics, we're an upcoming elections in a couple of days, and Economist magazine, I think, made a big, cover about it. It's one of the most important elections of this decade, and it's going to be really showing how it's going to be handled and what the results are going to be. We're really looking forward to see how the elections are being taken place. I'm right now based in London, so the people who are in London have already casted their votes. The Turkish citizens registered outside already casted their votes, and it was quite an interesting process, just to put it in short. So elections is a very important topic right now in Turkey, this current economic climate, the economic crisis, and the earthquake. 3 months ago, Turkey has been devastated by a very big earthquake, and which basically was in the southeast part of Turkey, where most of the Syrian refugees were already being settled. And the devastation was such a scale that I think it's going to take at least 20 years, if you're asking me, to be able to go back to what you consider to be normal, because the entire infrastructure has been completely demolished right now in the southeast parts of Turkey, especially in Hatay, Iskenderun, very close to the Syrian border, Antep, Malatya, Adıyaman. Those are the regions where the refugees are already living there in the last 10 years or so. So I would say that the most important issues that relates to the migration and the refugees will be the three important topics. One of them is housing. The housing, not only for the Syrian refugees and other migrants, but also for Turkish people too. There are right now millions of people are homeless in Turkey. In one night, they became homeless. And all your property, imagine yourself that you save for all your entire life to just buy one flat to live in, and suddenly in one night you just lost everything. So it is a very important issue, very major issue, but also not only a housing problem. It's one issue, one part of the story, but also the infrastructure has been completely devastated, demolished right now. There are hospitals in certain cities. Out of 5 hospitals, 4 hospitals are completely gone. They're in rubble. Industry is one of the issues that's been affected as well. Roads, infrastructure needs, like basic local government needs, have been destroyed. So this is going to be an issue that needs to be tackled by Turkey, but also that will need, but by no means, whoever is going to be elected on the 14th of May is going to be challenged by the issue of rebuilding a nation and rebuilding a region specifically. And that will require a lot of effort, time, organization, and financial means. And this cannot be done alone. So the international support will be needed. And this is not going to be specifically, I'm underlining this, not for refugees or migrants. This is going to be a need that needs to be making sure that the stability of the region is going to be assured. And the stability of the southeast border of Turkey is the stability of the European continent as well. And we have to realize that. So housing, infrastructure, and the third point I would like to make here is employment. We're talking about economic and social integration. I mean, well, it's pretty obvious that we didn't necessarily have a formal integration. We never said integration. We called uyum, harmonization. At the end of the day, it's been more than 10 years, and there has been economic and social integration of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and they were working, whether officially, unofficially, but there was a process. But right now, with the devastation of the whole infrastructure and the industry in the southeast part of Turkey, we cannot really expect employment opportunities for most of even Turkish citizens. And there has been a migration within Turkey from this region to different parts of Turkey. And the regional change, the population change, has been quite dramatic. And also, whoever has the means to leave the region has left already. And they left together with their financial resources, which will have also an additional, I say, like a secondary wave of impact on the region. So that's one issue that we need to focus on. And this has to be tackled through the EU in terms of not what has been done, I think, in 2016, because it's a different circumstances in 2016. These people came gradually. right, to Turkey. But in 2016, I think this time, different policies have to be adjusted, and this cannot be solved, I think, with cash transfers. Employment will be very critical, and this has to be the focus, I think, for all the policymakers that are going to be in charge, both in Turkey, at the EU level, at the international level. Employment opportunities, and how to provide the means for the people to find the jobs themselves, not to give the cash for the short term. Oh, sorry, I thought it was on silent. But to make sure that they're going to be able to survive by themselves. So I'm just going to make these points. I have many other issues that I would like to talk, and also the other issue, briefly, maybe one sentence or two, regarding the deportations and like possible returns, voluntary returns. Even there was a small chance of a small amount of people who would be voluntarily returning to the Syria before the earthquake. And I think after the earthquake, it became, I think, very slim chance with the devastation of Syria as well, beyond the border. Thank you.
Thank you, Başak, also for keeping to your allotted time and indeed for highlighting the very devastating consequences of the earthquake, all of which are very important and need to be kept in mind when thinking about future cooperation and support to refugees and migrants in the country. Now, I'm very pleased to hand over to Laura to share her thoughts. Laura, thanks very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anastasia, for the invitation. And as well, I echo, it's a pleasure to be with all of you as well today and to see familiar faces. I feel like many has been said already. I will try not to repeat some of the elements that are very important in this conversation, but I would maybe try to go back. I was asked in a way to assess how the implementation of the EU-Türkiye migration deal has gone. And I would like to start with that and then go a bit deeper into the current situation on the ground to see what else needs to be done. I mean, I would like to start by saying that this so-called EU-Türkiye deal on migration was meant to be a temporary measure, and still a few 6 or 7 years later, we still have it on the table, even if practically it could be argued that it's no longer working for a number of reasons. When you ask experts and practitioners whether this has been a successful deal or not, I mean, you will find different answers to that. Depends on what components of the deal you're looking into. There are two main components of the deal. One is the political one that we will not be going into that in detail because it's not the topic of our discussion today, which has to do mainly with all the political commitments in a way that were put on the table, namely the accession process, visa liberalization, the customs union, and so on and so forth, but also the migration component of it. And here, even if it could be argued that actually the deal has contributed to a significant reduction of the number of people crossing into Europe and risking their lives, it has also resulted in unintended consequences of it. One and foremost, the most important one is the containment policies in Greece and the Greek islands. And the other one is this new blueprint for externalization of migration policies to third countries. And I think these are two critical elements because arguably have also resulted in alleged human rights violations when implementing this deal. When you look at the numbers as well, the success is relative in a way. When it comes to resettlement, the numbers are far from the target of resettlements that the EU member states were supposed to take in. The target was at 72,000 and half of that has been reached. And even if the numbers have slowed down, the European Union committed to, put as part of the deal this voluntary humanitarian admission scheme that once these flows would be considerably reduced, member states could continue resettling more refugees, and this has never even been put in place. So the numbers speak for themselves, I would say. And when it comes to the returns from the Greek islands into Turkey, the numbers are even lower. So far, there has been only roughly 2,000 people who have been returned from Greece to Turkey under the deal. this is partly because Greece, the Greek courts acknowledge that Turkey is not a safe country to return refugees to. And since 2020, Turkey has refused to actually receive refugees from Greece, alleging COVID and another number of reasons. So in this sense, this component of the one-to-one mechanism is not working and has not been working for the last 3 years. One of the small successes of the deal is actually, and it has been referred to earlier, is the financial assistance to refugees, the so-called facility for refugees in Turkey. This has mobilized since 2012 around 10 billion euros in support for refugees in Turkey, which mostly has gone to these cash programs. But as earlier it was said by speakers, I mean, neither the cash programs are a solution to the long-term integration of refugees, nor this amount of money represents the amount of the challenge that Turkey has been facing when it comes to manage the reception of the refugees. And maybe to conclude on this point on the statement, while it has indeed probably, I mean, it has resulted in a very good technical cooperation when it comes to EU institutions and Turkish institutions in this regard, and it has helped the Turkish government to manage the reception of refugees. One important element that has never been achieved is social cohesion. Turkish people feel like this deal has not supported them at all and has completely neglected them. And there's this feeling of resentment, especially during the current economic situation, that refugees are being supported, but the host communities are not. And this is creating a big tensions in the society, that they are now more present than ever. So this is what Başak was alluding to, and we have seen how in the last, especially local elections, this was one of the topics that was highest on the political agenda. And since then, even if Turkey was not a very migration, was not a very politicized topic, in recent years we have seen how all political parties in the country have been becoming more anti-refugee in their political stance. And actually, this has been given birth to an ultra-right political party, with the Victory Party, that is actually calling actively to deport Syrian and Afghan refugees. The only exception among all the political parties in Turkey who are not advocating for the return of Syrian refugees is the HDP, who is actually not currently running as HDP for the upcoming elections, but under the Green Party of Turkey. It's the only party, and even the opposition has a tougher stance when it comes to the refugees in the country than the government at the moment. It was alluded before that on the one hand, the Turkish population overwhelmingly is in support, wants refugees to leave, but on the other hand, when it comes to the Syrian refugees, a majority prefers to stay. This is for two basic reasons. I mean, it is not safe to return, and there are no conditions for them to go back. And the other one is because they have been so long in Turkey that they established their lives. So I'm sure there will be questions about what might happen if whoever becomes the party that comes to government next in Turkey, what would this mean for refugees? But at the moment, refugees are here to stay, even if the opposition would win and would have tougher policies when it comes to refugees. At the moment, it's not possible simply to return them to Syria. So for them, at the moment, and in the months to come, I would say even the opposition is claiming in their national manifesto was arguing for actually abandoning the the so-called EU-Türkiye statement, or to review it, which is something that has been on the table earlier as well, especially in 2020 when the Turkish government opened the doors so that Syrians would go into Greece, and since then has been in renegotiation in a way. It has to be reviewed for sure, because it's not working on the one hand, because it needs to include many other aspects, especially now in the aftermath of the earthquake, as Başak was saying. I mean, there are now internally displaced people in this country. There are cities that are hosting many internally displaced citizens in Turkey, people are going back to living in camps, and we are returning for many of the Syrians who were living in the region to the need to cover their most basic needs. So it's like with COVID, we are going back to an emergency humanitarian situation. So it's on the one hand, we have to look after these basic needs, but as well take into account the livelihoods and the long-term prospects of Syrian refugees in the country. I feel my time is over, but I hope we will continue discussing this. Thank you.
Many thanks, and indeed looking forward to hear the views of the other speakers on the future of the statement and whether or not it should be reviewed. But with that, I'm very happy now to hand over to Tineke. Tineke, thank you for joining us online and for making time out of your very busy schedule to be with us today from Strasbourg. We're very pleased to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me, and indeed regards from Strasbourg. Can you hear me well? Yeah, okay.
Yes, perfectly.
I really enjoyed all the previous presentation. I think they already gave a very good picture of what is the state of play and what we can expect or maybe fear to happen. And I try to be as complimentary as possible. Actually, if you look at the EU-Turkey deal, it was not much more than a piece of paper. It was a press statement. It was about money and some exchanges of performances, but it was all based on the presumption, I would say, that with funding, the refugees would be guaranteed sufficient path of integration inside Turkey, and also that because Turkey is part of the European Convention on Human Rights, and it had developed an asylum system in the framework of the accession process, that Turkey could be perceived as a safe third country. But if you look now at the situation, and this is already clear for a couple of years, that the situation of Syrian refugees is very dire, and it's even worsening, I think, with the economic crisis in Turkey. Still, although a lot of pressure from the EU to really give Syrian refugees formal access to the labor market, there's only a very small number of formal working permits. So most of them depend on labor exploitation. There's a huge amount of people living in under the level of poverty. Of course, there's also in the meantime a lot of statelessness because children born out of Syria, most of them will not get the Syrian nationality, and access to naturalization is still also very difficult. I think there's an estimation 250,000 of Syrian refugees has gained the Turkish nationality. So the situation is protracted, sort of, and in a temporary situation, but not with sufficient possibilities to really develop into a sustainable future where they really are full citizens of Turkey. But also, if you look at the other nationalities, for instance, people coming from Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq. Formally there is a kind of asylum system, but we hear time and time again that they have huge difficulties to access that asylum procedure. They are most of the time refused to register as asylum seekers. And because of that, they stay on the territory on an irregular basis, running the risk at any moment to be apprehended and expelled. And this happens, for instance, with Afghans on a very large scale. Many people are simply put on a charter and sent back to Kabul without any individual assessment. And as we all know, of course, EU is also funding the building of walls with the border of Iran and Iraq as well. So it's also very difficult for them to enter in a safe space and get protection. I think at the same time, although the country cannot be perceived as a safe third country, I must say, Laura said indeed in the beginning, the Greek courts were tempted to say that it's not a safe third country, so they should get protection. but this practice is departed for a long time already. So most of the asylum seekers who enter Greece are declared inadmissible because of they could go back to Turkey and ask for asylum there. And that means that they end up in a limbo situation because they are rejected. They are kept on the islands, but they cannot return. As already mentioned, that since the last 3 years, no one is being taken back by Erdogan. So on the main elements, you could say that the EU-Turkey deal is sort of dead. It doesn't function. But at the same time, asylum seekers who enter from Turkey in the EU are still affected by it. And also the funding for hosting refugees has continued without very strong, in my impression, without very strong conditions as to how those refugees should be treated. And of course, we already have a lot of concerns about the increasing number of deportations also back to Syria. And you can question to what extent all these deportations are, returns are on a voluntary basis. We hear very concerning reports about that. And as already mentioned, the election campaign is centering very much around actually the whole slogan and objective to deport many more refugees back to Syria. So yeah, what next? The election become very important and also exciting for many reasons. If the opposition would win, some concerns could be solved. I mean, if they return to a more or less a rule of law situation, if they start respecting democracy and fundamental rights, we may have a partner that we can better negotiate with. And I think the EU should then also reconsider what to do with the accession process, because it has been frozen completely due to the repressive regime of Erdogan. If that really fundamentally changes, the EU should reconsider as well, of course. And if that's the case, I mean, we still have this promise of the opposition to deport refugees, but being able to more actively engage with the government, if it consists of parties that are willing to respect rule of law and democracy, would enable the EU also to step up its engagement if it comes to refugees. On the one hand, by stepping up financial means, and it was already said by Başak that not only for the refugees but also for the whole societies. I think that's really key to show that we care for everyone residing in Turkey, also to regain more support for the Syrian refugees. So step up significantly the financial means. And use our leverage. I think then we might have more serious leverage to also put conditions on the way that refugees and asylum seekers are treated, so that they can really become more part of society. So better access to the labor market, to naturalization, to non-discrimination practice, and of course a full-fledged effective protection system. So I think it could cause a concern for refugees if there would be a shift in the elections. But I think what is more important, it also would create more chances, new opportunities for the EU to more engage into the relationship with Turkey, because we need Turkey for many reasons. And of course, the last thing that then should definitely be done is stepping up resettlement. It has already been mentioned, the EU is very much lagging behind, and we should substantially step up this, also to show that we are credible. We're not only paying to get rid of refugees, but we pay to host refugees, to offer them sustainable protection, but we take our fair share. And this is what did not happen before. And of course, if Erdogan would win, I think many of the things would still be valid, that we would still need to significantly step up our support, but at the same time, take care of that we are not subsidizing an autocrat using the means for different reasons. So we managed to avoid that by funding most of the times international organizations. And that will be the challenge, of course, because if you really want to impose conditions onto how refugees and asylum seekers are treated, it may be difficult to exclude the government completely in stepping up financial assistance as well. But yeah, I think we really need to prepare for those two scenarios. We will soon know which scenario will be needed to be applied. But yeah, let's hope it becomes an avenue, an opportunity, because as already said, it is a crisis for so many years already. And we tend just to look away from it. And it's really time that we face it and see how we can improve it. Thanks.
Thanks, Tineke, for sharing your reflections on what the future should hold, of course, based on ongoing and previous cooperation. I would now be very happy to pass the floor back to all of our speakers for a quick round of initial thoughts, initial reflections, but I would kindly request that you please keep these interventions to 2 minutes max. And a reminder also to those of you who are with us online that you're welcome to please already post any questions you may have in the Q&A box. So with that, Matthias, if you would like to share any initial reflections or thoughts you have on the input so far from the other speakers, please go ahead for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I don't think I need 2 minutes. I think it's been a very lively discussion, putting some flesh on some of the things that I started saying. So I'm very happy to further discuss your suggestions and pass the floor.
Thanks, short and sweet. Then Başak.
Hi, I was just trying to see there's a comment that my voice is echoing. I don't know what to do about it. I apologize for that. If I'm hearing myself too, and I apologize. I'm getting comments on that. What I would like to say is also, I hear my echo. Also that I'm seeing very recently on social media and also the academic writings and policy writing, there's either an or situation. Like we need to pick a location which is far more important and geographically more critical for the EU than the other, and has been the Ukrainian case recently. I find it quite troubling that we need to choose between two important issues. This is not a pick and choose matter, I think. They're very separate, and they're, I think, equally important issues that needs to be tackled for the security stability of the whole region, not only the EU. And if we have this debate or diminish this debate into this, and then we will, I think, end up having a very polarized discussion. And you have to pick a side in terms of humanitarian crisis, no matter what. Like what is happening in Ukraine is quite dramatic and very, very sad. And also what has to be done with regards to the refugees in Turkey is also as equally important, and not maybe. It's been 10 years, so people imagine that this has not necessarily had that kind of need. But as I try to underline and I try to give you a picture that it is kind of war zone right now in the southeast of Turkey, and it happened one day. It didn't happen over the days that people had the opportunity to flee away. I mean, it happened in one night, and it happened in a minute, and was done. So I find it a bit troubling to make this comparison, and I see in Twitter, and I've seen it in other discussions that this is going on. I think this shouldn't be done. I think there are different priorities of the EU that has to be put forward. There is also a cooperation, as Matthias was saying that, and also Tineke was also saying that Turkey is needed, not only for migration front, but various other fronts as well. And you cannot necessarily have a collaboration and cooperation if you pick and choose. And what happened in the previous 2016 deal was that there were two aspects of that deal. One of them was related to the refugees, which was successfully delivered. And I think they're with the tools that's been used, refugees have been integrated in Turkey informally. But the second aspect, which was the revitalization of the Turkey-EU relations, which was not delivered. And what happened is that the morality of the EU has been lost because of this. The credibility and the trust to the EU was also lost. Not opening chapters, and it's been a declaration that there's not going to be any opening or closing of chapters. There has been a resentment by the Turkish Western-minded and EU-supporting citizens and the elite. And I think this is something very important, and that has to be also on the table. The customs union has to be amended and modernized. And this has to be also one of the issues that has to be on top of the agenda when the migration issues are being also discussed. I'm not saying that they should be linked together. I do not agree on that, but it has to be also on the agenda. Thank you. I'll keep it this much right now.
Many thanks, Başak. And for us in the room, we could hear you perfectly. So apologies to persons online if the sound is not clear. We're trying to sort it out, but indeed in the room, we could hear you loud and clear. Laura, I'll hand it over to you for any reflections.
Yes, I would say following a bit on what was earlier said, I feel like regardless of what happens on Sunday and when we know, I mean, which government will be in place, there is really a need to reset somehow our relations or our dialogue, at least, with Turkey. And migration is one of the topics that is going to be high on the agenda, if not put forward by Turkey first. And as I was saying at the beginning about this temporary deal, and something I wanted to mention is that when there is political will, there is a way. We have seen that with the Ukrainian refugees. So there is a way to bring 4 million refugees into Europe and to offer them safe and legal channels to come here, work permits, and ways in which they can integrate and have a work permit and things like this. I want to emphasize as well, because sometimes there's a misunderstanding that even if the political discourse in Turkey has been different or gives the impression that they want to send back the refugees, there has been an integration and harmonization policy on the table. Indeed, I mean, all these temporary protection status has been a pathway for them to find access to education, find access to the labor market, and other basic needs like health as well. But it's not enough, and this is where we are at the moment. I mean, also because of issues that Turkey itself has, like the informality of the economy that affects to 30% of the economy. It's not only that the refugees work informally, but also many Turkish people. This is what I believe that in subsequent funding cycles of the EU towards Turkey, I mean, this is something that needs to be continually discussed. And there was a very positive example of technical cooperation, which was this steering committee of the Facility for Refugees in Turkey. I remember it being one of the most efficient channels of discussion where real work was being done. And I feel like both sides, again, I mean, it's not about finding the right term about whether we talk about integration or harmonization, but to find, like, especially now that we're back to this more humanitarian crisis situation, find ways in which this the livelihoods of refugees in Turkey, and not only Syrians, can be sustained in a way.
Thanks, Laura. Tineke, back to you.
Yeah, just very briefly responding to Başak. I mean, I agree with you, of course, that not all agreements have been fulfilled of the EU-Turkish statement. But we cannot close our eyes for the complete crackdown on the rule of law and human rights in Turkey. And I think we also have this with many other neighboring countries, that we need to be credible in upholding the Copenhagen criteria. And this is really now limiting very much the possibilities for engaging more deeply with Turkey in terms of opening chapters or whatever. And this is why I mentioned that hopefully, you know, with a change of the government, that these avenues would be opened up. But I also see, what you said about more increasing economic cooperation, perhaps that could be that could help anyhow. But then also maybe with some conditions or incentives to make sure that there's also a healthy economic policies, because I really have the impression that due to the corruption and the short-term choices, that the economy is very hurt, and that is not because of the 4 million Syrian refugees, but more of the decisions taken, the political measures taken by the government.
Many thanks, Tineke, and to all speakers for keeping the second round very short and sweet. Now, with that, I am very pleased to hand over to Kale, who will be providing us with a segue today into the Q&A. I know who will be sharing some of her initial thoughts, reflections, reactions on the input of the speakers today. So, Kale, many thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours for about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers for all the extremely interesting points. So I will come in just very quickly on a few things that were already put forward, and also maybe adding a couple more, but I will try to keep it to 5 minutes. So I've been sitting here and listening to all the points. I think there is quite a very comprehensive overview of all the aspects that are related to the elections and the future of the EU-Turkey cooperation. But I think for me, from where I stand, the way I see the elections panning out, it is a very contentious domestic process, and there is a lot that can be said about where the results are going to go. But the way I see it, we are, in terms of Syrian refugees, who I remind everybody constitute the bulk of the vast majority of refugees in Turkey right now. We're talking about 90%. I just see, regardless of who wins, just an overall trend of different facets of an overall worsening of the situation, really. So I think this is the starting point for me. I think the deterioration that we've seen at the local level, starting from the local elections in 2019, and then the worsening of the economic situation internally, the high inflation, and the devaluation of the Turkish lira, and then obviously everything worsening with COVID, and even the war in Ukraine having a major impact on Turkey. We have seen this reflecting locally, and all the, in terms of access to informal employment, etc. There are a lot of fractures right now between Syrian refugees and local communities, even those that at the beginning have shown great generosity. So I think there is something that will need to be fixed when we look at the future of this cooperation. Obviously, not much will be said until the election process will terminate and we will have clear results, hopefully. But there will need to be an aspect on how do you shape this fracture, how do you repair this fractured relationship, really. I think at the same time, we have a situation where durable solutions, when we look at, integration, resettlement, and return, are highly unattainable. Experts talk about them never being this unattainable in the last 10 years. So really, we have a lack of a menu for Syrian refugees to tap into. Really, there is really little that they can do right now to improve their situation. And in terms of what I worry the most about when we look at the future of the EU-Turkey cooperation, really the trajectory that we see, first of all, the region going towards, including Turkey, towards normalization of relations with the Assad regime, and even Turkey showing very clear signs that it's willing to follow the regional trajectory. What this could do when you look at European relations, because obviously our power is very limited, our leverage is very limited. We have very clear alliances with all these actors. And I have very strong fears that given our domestic agenda in terms of return cooperation, that we might head towards a future EU-Turkey migration agreement that really looks at cooperation on returns in the north of Syria, in the safe zones. And this is really scary. We know, and we maintain ourselves as Europeans, that Syria is unsafe in all of its different territorial dimensions. So this is the first point that I really worry about. And I do think, back to Matthias' point, that returns are extremely limited right now. I completely agree. But there are some people who are returning, and this is also something that needs to be looked at. I think there needs to be a more concerted effort into securing significant monitoring, and very clearly to state politically that this is by no means to encourage returns, but just to make sure that those who return are safe. And that's also another aspect that I think really needs to be emphasized. When it comes to, I would just very briefly touch on the other sort of durable solutions. In terms of resettlement, I completely agree with Tineke. In terms of resettlement, still needs to be considered. And I do very much agree with the fact that it is really a way for us to be credible as a sort of as an actor that cooperates on this matter. And really, when I spoke to experts about this, they really say that it really doesn't take a huge number of resettlements. I know that politically right now, to be realistic in the political climate, it's quite complicated to really talk about huge numbers for resettlement, but we really need to do more just to show it as a gesture of goodwill towards our regional allies. And when it comes to integration, the word is very contentious. I personally talk about inclusion because in my research, I found that that works better in terms of having that extremely difficult conversation. And yeah, it comes down to all the things that were already laid by the other speakers. It comes down to really acknowledging, first of all, that this situation, at least for the time being, is there to be dealt with. And so we really need to go beyond cash assistance, beyond short-term support, which is extremely important and should not stop, but really what else we can do to find other avenues for longer-term assistance. I think I'll stop here, but of course, very happy to address any questions that emerge.
Perfect. Many thanks, Kelly. And with that, we are now well on our way to the Q&A. We have about half an hour left, and so we'd be very happy to take any questions from you here in the audience in person. A reminder again to those of us who are with us online, please do post your questions in the chat. Again, if any of them would be directed towards Başak or Laura, I will give them priority as they will be stepping out earlier. There was indeed mention in the chat of the role, for example, of the private sector in the shift towards the long term. Of course, there has also been, in the context of this discussion, talk of, for example, using trade incentives as ways to facilitate longer term prospects and integration for those who are currently in Turkey. And so I would perhaps pose this to our panelists as the first question. What would you make of those possibilities? Perhaps, Başak, this is an answer which you would be happy to come in on. Laura, likewise, you raised the question of employment. So if you would like to weigh in after Başak on that. So we'll take that as a first question, and then I would be very happy to turn to all of you in the audience. If you would like to raise any questions, then please do signal to me, and my colleague Marina will bring around the microphone. But in the meanwhile, Başak, over to you.
Thank you. I think this is a critical issue, an important issue, the trade incentive issue, because it's an alternative to the cash assistance and supporting those kind of more financial matters, which are usually short term. I have contributed to Euromesco's migration series with the piece on this, the trade incentives as in order to support refugee resilience in different countries. And I think EU tries to do this with different models in different regions, like in Africa, in the Middle East, with Jordan, with Ethiopia compact. There are different options that it's been tried in a way. But I believe that those options have to be worked on I mean, there are legal and international limitations of how much of it can be pushed forward because it's something related to WTO. It is not only related to the EU. WTO has to be on board, countries have to be on board in order to push for these kind of different routes. But I think it's a very good, this is a start in that regard. And the disadvantages for Turkey is that Turkey is not necessarily the least developed nation. So because of that, there are certain disadvantages, but the advantage is that Turkey already has a customs union. Maybe through this modernization of the customs union, different aspects can be developed through this, and this can be added. The different sectors that are more refugee employed could be supported. I mean, EU is already doing the import from various countries anyways. So this could become the priority region. It's not going to cost the EU extra money, but it is a more long-term solution. It's a win-win solution in that regard for the country and also for the EU and for the migrants that is involved. And I think there was one comment that says the goodwill. It is not about the goodwill. Turkey is right now doing a public good for the region. Hosting 4 million refugees is a public good, like what NATO does, right? In terms of creating stability and security. So this has to be, I think, acknowledged regardless of the political parties. I mean, I agree, Tineke, with all the things you've said. The democratic conditions have been not where we expect them to be in Turkey. But the problem was that when penalizing the authoritarian government, it has been also the case that the Turkish citizens who are not necessarily always supporting the authoritarian government has been penalized as well. And this is something very upsetting for especially the new generations who have been only seeing one government in the last 20 years. So they want to see hope. They want to see something that is also an alternative that is possible. And that's what was the loss of, I think, my students' generation. And I'm quite sad about it because there has only been one government and there has not been an alternative to that. And unfortunately, EU kind of let down a bit too late in this penalization. I hope I'm safe right now, being in London.
Many thanks, Başak. Laura, if you would like to share any thoughts on that, you would be welcome to.
Maybe a reflection, which is not only particularly to the Turkish case, but in general, when speaking about migrants and refugees, there is always a tendency to look at them as a burden to our societies more than as contributors to the economy, but not also the economy, I mean, socially and culturally to our societies. And I feel here in the Turkish case, could be, I mean, something that could be turned into an opportunity. I mean, trying to transition from this cash assistance into permanent employment, and then trying to remove barriers to for them to access the labor market. Also, because many of them, half of them, I think they are eligible to be employed. This would really create opportunities and tap into their potential to contribute to the economy. This is something that is not being experimented with at the moment. There are not enough, for instance, inclusive hiring practices. I feel like the image that refugees have in Turkey is always a damaging one, but there are a few companies, and there are examples actually. There are a few Ashoka fellows in Turkey who are trying to do programs which encourage these inclusive hiring practices or reverse mentorship between business organizations and companies and young talent from Turkey and also Syria, and trying to develop these more inclusive job placement services. And something that has not probably been looked at very closely is how to foster public-private partnerships to develop, actually to create more employment opportunities. So this is especially when it comes to entrepreneurship, because as we know, I mean, migrants are usually entrepreneurs by nature, not because because basically they don't have another choice. And there are many examples, if we look at that, of successful entrepreneurship practices also, and mostly among women, actually. And here, for instance, in Belgium, we also find examples of what Syrian refugees are trying to do in order to create their own jobs. So I feel like this is something that could be explored in the alternative that it's not possible to secure access to full access to the labor market because of the many barriers that exist also for Turkish citizens themselves.
Many thanks to both for sharing those very valuable reflections. Now, to Matthias, Kale, and Tineke, I would like to hear your thoughts on this. However, I would like to give persons in the room the opportunity to pose any questions. In particular, should you have any for Laura and Başak, in case they will need to leave early. If not, then what I will do is hand over directly to you, Tineke. I can see you were signaling to come in, or was that?
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you. I mean, to Başak, I really recognize, of course, that the people are let down also by the EU, and it's not unique that the EU was very late in responding to Erdogan's backsliding. I mean, we also see that in the EU itself, on Hungary and Poland, and we are famous in being late. But actually, I would also say that the EU's attitude towards the Turkish government is very ambiguous. And this is actually also letting the citizens down, because we don't want to speak out on the human rights situation on Turkey. Our human rights criticism is completely gone due to the fear of becoming, hijacked by Turkey through instrumentalizing the migrants against the EU. So on the one hand, we are a little bit afraid for Erdogan. And on the other hand, we try to be firm by freezing the accession talks. And I think this is really very problematic, whereas the society is the main who loses about it, because they are not, the EU is not a partner for them, but it's actually only preserving its own interest. And I think with real engagement, that the EU should be also open and fair and be critical on where it's going wrong, critical about all those people in jail and without a fair process, etc., etc. And at the same time, then make clear to Erdogan, when and how they could cooperate, and that they want to see certain improvements. But now, both of the things are not happening, and I agree with you in that sense that the EU should have chosen the side of the citizens. And with Kale, I fully agree that this is a huge threat that has become normalized, that people return to North Syria, despite UNHCR's clear position. I noticed for years ago already that there are also some EU member states who responded positively to the request of Erdogan to invest in reception camps in North Syria. I think this is a very dangerous development. And there the EU should really try to stay united and not let them be played out, because this is indeed the whole strategy, of course, of Erdogan, that this is the buffer zone. And you also see it changing in the EU, with Denmark withdrawing the permits of Syrian refugees. If this will happen in more and more member states, it becomes even more difficult to stay credible towards Turkey, saying that it's not a safe option at the moment to consider.
Many thanks, Tineke. Matthias, handing over to you.
Thanks. I would go back briefly on trade incentives because I'm a trade economist by background, going back a long time, and I think the point has been made correctly that when you have abolished all tariffs, as have been abolished in the case of the customs union between Turkey and the European Union, then there are no further trade incentives to be created. Basically, full stop. I can stop here. I mean, there isn't much else to say. And this is the problem with all the trade incentives that the EU has to create, including for free trade zones in Jordan, which have all sorts of issues. But the fundamental issue is that the possible margin, the possible positive discrimination in favor of goods produced by refugees through international tariffs is just simply too low. So this is not an option. I think we can think about all sorts of ways of supporting refugee-led enterprises, or supporting communities that host refugees, but international trade incentives are not really a big part of that picture. We looked at this in the MEDAM project as well, and I think the conclusion is relatively clear. The other point is of course we always like to engage in a little bit of EU bashing and how did we let down Turkish citizens, but in fairness to the EU, when you look at an issue like visa liberalization, which would be hugely important for Turkey and which you could actually make progress on without getting the French on board on EU accession of Turkey, to put it bluntly. You cannot, I mean, the EU, the way the system has been set up, the EU cannot really have visa liberalization with a country where the human rights situation is progressively deteriorating. Full stop, quite simply, I mean, pragmatically, because then people could freely come to the EU and successfully claim asylum, pointing to the deteriorating human rights situation. And that seems to be the main element of that logic. And it seems that Turkish citizens are now one of the more prominent nationalities among asylum seekers. That's a relatively recent development. It happened over the last couple of years. So we are moving further away even from possible progress in an area where it would be possible without all the other things that have become attached to the EU-Turkey relationship. So I think they're really, so however said it is, but when the government is engaging in acts that like allowing a worsening of human rights, then the citizens will be affected and the EU cannot save them, basically. That's my very short conclusion on this. And this is very sad, because visa liberalization would be one area where we could make relatively easy progress if it weren't for the worsening human rights situation.
Many thanks, Matthias. And indeed, the point on visa liberalization is an important one, and one that has come up in the lead up to the elections, particularly with the opposition saying that this is something they would address should they come into power. Kale, any thoughts on your end on these questions?
Yes, thank you. No, I agree with Matthias also on the example of Jordan. There is of course a EU-Jordan compact, and that did not really bring many dividends. So it's a very complicated issue on that front. But just to pick up also on our sort of reluctance and inability to really criticize human rights violations, deportations, not only in Turkey but also Lebanon, and actually a level, I don't want to say of being complicit, but when you look at what's happening in Libya, it's quite dire. But I think the effect that this has, regardless of how active we are on this, and Denmark is a very crucial example on this point. Denmark hasn't actually brought anybody back because they don't have diplomatic relationships with the Assad government. But what people are hearing in the region is, if the EU is doing it, why can't we? And they have more leeway to establish those relationships. So in that case, the threat becomes very real. And a Syrian refugee in a country where you see these openings towards returning people and these pressures there, which are very real, a normal refugee wonders, I feel more and more insecure. I feel like I could be deported tomorrow, because this is how the situation is for many people, especially in the aftermath of the earthquake. So you think I need to act preemptively, and the direction people go at this juncture is not back to Syria, is towards Europe. So in terms of going back to the first question, as the EU-Turkey agreement worked, arrivals of Syrians, in February have doubled by 42% compared to February 2022. So I really don't think it has worked. Yeah, I think I'll stop here, and I see that people have to leave.
Many thanks, Kale. And many thanks to Lara, who indeed now has to step out. Now, I would be very happy to take some more questions from the floor. If anybody would like to come in, please once again do signal to me, and my colleague Marina will bring the microphone to you. Yes, so Marina, we have one here. Yeah, this gentleman in the second row. Yeah. Thanks. If you could just state your name and affiliation, and likewise if you want to pose the question to anyone in particular. Thanks.
Başak, Royal Hair Institute for Defense here in Brussels. My question was kind of directed towards the European Union, so I don't know who's most qualified to answer, but it's for the whole group, I guess. How does the EU stand towards either the Erdogan government or a new government making a deal with Syria, be it with intermediaries such as Russia and Iran, on the Syrian refugees or the Syrian states in general? Like, would that change the EU stance on how they would approach Turkey concerning the migrants and refugees, or what are the views on that? Thank you.
And then, yeah, we'll just have one more question here.
Yes. Thanks to all panelists for the reflections. My name is Alberto Neidert, and I'm the head of the migration program here at EPC. I'm wondering if we could hear more from you about what are the political prospects for the years to come, in the sense that the elections are important, but we shouldn't lose I think, sight of the longer term effects of the growing anti-refugee sentiment in the country. And on the one hand, from what I understand, migration is used as a political card to win votes. On the other hand, unrealistic promises are being made to the Turkish electorate. And we know also from the European context that this can lead to growing resentment, which could in turn make the definition of a progressive and evidence-based approach to migration policies very difficult, and this could also impact cooperation with the EU. So, are you worried about this prospect? And yeah, if we could pick your brains on this, it would be helpful. And just as a follow-up question, a very quick one, what about Syrians who have naturalized, and what about their vote in these elections and in the ones to come, considering that there is the prospect of more and more Syrian refugees naturalizing in the longer term? Thank you.
Thanks. And then one more question on the floor. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Eleonora Milazzo. I'm a joint research fellow at the EPC and Egmont. My question is really about your views regarding the results of other two elections that are going to take place in the next months in Greece and in Cyprus. So I was wondering, and these results are going to be relevant for trade and energy and migration management as well. So I was wondering how or where do you see the stability of the region going, including in terms of migration management in the broader context of this other elections? Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Eleonora. So now I'll hand back over to the speakers. Başak, perhaps you would like to come in first?
I would like to make a few comments on not all the questions, don't worry, but I also need to run away, unfortunately. Apologies for that. And maybe I answered the question about the naturalized citizens. Maybe that would be useful. It is difficult to know the exact number of Syrians who have become Turkish citizens. There are many debates on that. And one of my master's students, Omar Katker, even wrote his master thesis on this. You can access it, and it's mostly highly skilled Syrians that has been naturalized, became citizens. It's estimated about 158,000 Syrians have become Turkish citizens now. And mostly, as I said, we don't really have open access data that we can confirm, but men, women, and some of them are definitely highly skilled. And probably the numbers will also increase after the elections. Not all of them, when we did a more micro study, it shows that not all of them are interested in voting for local elections. There's a higher interest in voting for the national elections, like this coming one. So just because they are naturalized Syrians become Turkish citizens doesn't mean that they're very much politicized. So it doesn't necessarily correlate. But what we can see is that that over the time, over the course of the time, gradually there will be more and more Syrians who are going to be naturalized, because especially the children who are born in Turkey, they don't necessarily have a citizenship. This is an issue that we don't necessarily talk about very much, but they're born in Turkey. They have temporary protection registrations, but not necessarily a passport. And we can see that the number will increase, whether we like it or not. That's going to be the case. And yes, it's correct that they have been used as political tools so far in the elections by every single party that's imaginable, but that will be the case. Thank you. And I would like to also take the opportunity to thank very much for EPC for having me. Hope to joining again for another event, and hopefully this time in person in Brussels. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Başak. Indeed, we hope so too. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon and for your very valuable contributions. Tineke, perhaps I can hand over to you now if you would like to come in.
Yes, thanks. Very good questions, and they are so much interrelated. On the one hand, the question about the relationship with Assad and how the EU should position itself. On the other hand, the long-term strategy and also the increasing resentments, which we also see in the EU. And they are so much related because, well, I think it's really key for the EU that we keep Turkey close with us if it comes to a response to Assad, to the regime in Syria, and to see how we can best protect and support the citizens that are still living there, in order not to make sure that Turkey is indeed not going to ally with Russia and Iran on that, in that regard, and especially if their objective is to be able to send back, to return refugees to Syria. It would really be dangerous if Turkey would feel alone and not be backed by EU, because actually we as an EU make clear to Turkey that they should not deport refugees back to Syria. But then we should also stay on their side if it comes to a healthy strategy on that. And indeed, actually, I must admit, I've never supported the whole EU-Turkey deal. I mean, I really think it's too much designed from the interest of the EU to have this guarantee of preventing departures and readmissions, and to shift the responsibility to transit countries which are already hosting the largest number of refugees. And you see it worldwide at the moment that you concentrate the number of refugees in a country, in a transit country, and you put pressure on containing them there. Of course, the support is going down. I mean, the resentments that we know in the EU are everywhere, of course. We are not unique, and the Turkish population in Lebanon, etc., are exactly the same, especially if economy goes down. So in that sense, I would really hope for a reset and have a more long-term strategy. And my take would be much more in the sense like invest heavily, much more heavily in hosting the refugees so that they are not deported to Syria and that they can finally build a more sustainable future and at the same time take our own share. So, but use the funding and the investment as a leverage to also make clear to the Turkish authorities, please strengthen the rights of the refugees. And you can only do that if you show that you are also opening up your borders for a part of them. I don't see any other way, actually. If indeed what Kale also said, If we still continue like this, so we're silent on the poverty, on the rights of the lack of rights of refugees, their precarious situation, and the threat of deporting to Syria becomes more real, we will be faced with more refugees coming from Turkey. Of course, they are going to find another place of safety. This is what happened in 2016. So a more long-term strategy would really be to engage on hosting refugees and do it more together, really based on a common responsibility.
Many thanks, Tineke. Matthias, over to you.
Yes, if I may, I'd actually like to ask a difficult question that I don't have an answer to, but I'm motivated by Tineke saying we have to make sure that Turkey doesn't feel alone. And one sense in which Turkey, I think, will often feel alone is with our EU position towards its security situation in northern Syria. This is something that came through to me very clearly from discussing this with my Turkish co-author, who is not a fan of any radical political movement, but she basically shared the sense that the security situation with the PKK is actually a serious one, and of course Turkey has gone in through limited invasions of Syrian territory. And there are good reasons why the EU doesn't find that helpful, but there is still left a sense of Turkey being left alone to deal with the situation, and maybe then being tempted to undertake ever more radical actions. And of course, in this context, there is still the issue of 1 million internal Syrian refugees in Idlib province, basically living in open fields, and probably now they have primitive tents. But is there anything that anybody can see where the EU, while staying true to its own values, can do to move the situation ahead? I think this is one of the big issues that we don't talk about very much, but it's like the elephant in the room.
Many thanks, Matthias. Kale, I will pass on to you for any thoughts or reflections. And Tineke, of course, if you would like possibly to come back in based on Matthias's comment, then please feel free to do so after Kale.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly. So I think in terms of the European sort of stance on how Syrian refugees might even be returned to northern Syria, if that also proceeds politically in the region. I mean, I think regardless, I think what's very clear, regardless of the regional realignment and Turkish realignment with Iran, with Syria, Syrian refugees can be returned in the north now because the north is under Turkish control, at least those areas. They can already return them. Of course, it would complicate this rapprochement that's occurring, but it can still happen. It's very different, for example, for Syrian refugees who are returning from Lebanon, because of course that requires cooperation with the Assad regime. But in the case of Turkey, there is something. There are steps that can already be taken, and that's why these plans that were announced are very concerning. Obviously, the opposition has spoken about this being financed by the EU. So we really have to acknowledge that we do have a leverage, and we should really be careful on how we use it, if we decide to use it. And we should really think about whether and how it might help us fulfill our political goals on the resolution of the political conflict in Syria. In terms of years to come, there are beyond the elections, there are two things that I would say. I mean, the first one is the more time goes by, and this goes also back to the amount of Syrians who are now being naturalized, the more time goes by, the more UN surveys tell us that the amount of Syrians that answer that they wish to return to Syria one day decreases. So we should really think about how that plays out. And when we talk about the voluntariness of returns, we really need to first and foremost emphasize that the will of Syrian refugees at the end of the day is what will have to drive policy here. And so we should really think about what in the years to come, how do we really shape this cooperation in this front? And in terms of that, one thing I would add is the need to, beyond the private sector, also cooperate more with local organizations, and especially refugee-led organizations. They have the expertise, they have the experience, and they are the ones that are the closest to Syrian refugees. So I think our support is highly channeled through international organizations, through the UN, but I think there should be more room to also directly support local organizations as well. I think I'll stop here.
Many thanks, Kelly. Now we are just past 4 o'clock, so I think with that, I am going to draw to a close. Apologies for being a few minutes over time. But indeed, a very big thanks to all of you who joined us here in person, and likewise to all of those who joined us online. Most importantly, a big thanks to our speakers for being with us here today for what's really been a very engaging and rich discussion. Surely there remains much more still to be covered. I would like to quickly personally thank Matthias, but likewise also the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the Migration Policy Center, who have been our very trusted partners in the context of the MEDAM project in previous years. I'd also like to thank the EMD team and our colleagues in events here at the EPC, Julia and Tatiana, really for their invaluable work behind the scenes in making sure that the event went ahead smoothly. So with that, many thanks to all. Please do join us next door for some refreshments if you can stay until about 5 p.m. and wishing everybody a nice afternoon. And many thanks again to our speakers online and our online audience.
Yes, and thanks to Anastasia and colleagues for setting it up for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias.
Thank you very much, and have a nice drink afterwards.
Thank you.
Many thanks. Bye.